So, Trevor, we're going to kick things off with, as you mentioned, sort of with a stacking up feature, and this is really interesting because there's the looking at it from a number standpoint, and obviously the numbers are going to tell a certain part of the story. And as you get into this point in the season where you're halfway through the year in Navy's case, and in Notre Dame's case, you're a game past the halfway point, you start getting a better idea of where a team is statistically. And really, when I do this article earlier in the season, when I was doing this article on the front page of the website, I was still using 2023 data and then having to use the written part as context for what we've seen so far this year because you really don't know. I think back to the 2015 season, when Notre Dame played Georgia Tech. And if you remember correctly, Georgia Tech coming into that season was highly ranked. They were a top 20 football team. I think they ranked 15th when they played Notre Dame. I'm actually looking at their schedule from that year now. 14th. They were as high as 14th. Came into the season ranked real high. They'd gone 11-3 the year before, played in the ACC title game, lost to Florida State in a barn burner. I don't know if you remember that game. It was a great game. And then come out the first game of the year, they beat Alcorn State 69-6. They beat Tulane 65-10. And you're thinking, man, this is going to be a real tough game. Boy, this Georgia Tech team is really good. And Notre Dame was coming off of a couple really hard-fought games coming into that point in time. The Irish were, I think, 2-0. They had played Texas and Virginia. It was their first start with Deshaun Kaiser. I don't know if you remember that. Durham Smythe was out. Torian Folson was out. Jerron Jones was out. Sean Crawford was out. That was a beat-up football team, and it's going to be a dogfight. And come and find out, Georgia Tech stunk. We just didn't know it yet. Notre Dame won that game 30-22. It was not that close. They scored twice in the last couple minutes. Recovered an onside kick, went down and scored, recovered another onside kick. And they finished that year 3-9. Week after losing at Notre Dame, went out and lost to Duke by 2 touchdowns, a decent Duke team with David Cutcliffe. So you don't really know how good teams are. We got a much better idea now, although there's obviously still a learning process. And then with Navy in certain aspects of it too, it's like, okay, I know Navy's good. My eyes can tell me that Navy's good. But how good, it's kind of hard to tell because of who they've played so far. And so we'll dive into that a little bit too, Trevor. But this statistical matchup between these two teams is really fascinating because there's a lot of good on good in this matchup. There really is. And some good on good statistically that I wasn't expecting to necessarily be the case. And we'll dive into that, especially with the defense. But of course, Trevor, we're going to start with the offense and look at the Notre Dame offense and how they stack up against this Navy defense. And when you first start things off, it's going to be about the ground game, Trevor. And the numbers tell the story. I mean, Notre Dame all season has been a pretty good team rushing the football. They've had a couple games here and there. They didn't run the ball overly well. The Louisville game obviously was one they didn't run the ball very well. The Northern Illinois game is one they didn't run it very well. I actually thought they ran the ball pretty well against Georgia Tech, considering how much of Georgia Tech's game plan was geared towards stopping the run. That was a Georgia Tech. Notre Dame had 168 yards and 4.3 yards per carry, right? Not great numbers. But it was over 60 yards beyond what Georgia Tech's season high or season average was going into the game, and about a full yard beyond it. And then you consider that they had 2 plays where they took a knee in the game, which kind of factored into the yards per carry would have been closer to 4.5, 4.6 in the game if you take those 2 plays out. So overall, it was a pretty solid performance. They ran the ball really well against a Stanford team that's been a pretty quality rush defense so far this season. And, you come into the game and say, okay, well, Notre Dame's run game is pretty good. And for all the issues that we have with the Notre Dame offensive line when it comes to pass protection, this is an area that for the most part, they've been pretty, at the very least, good at, and at times really good at. And then you flip it over on the other side and you did the data, Trevor, and Navy hasn't been a great rushing team this year. And it's not just because they've played a triple option team. A lot of times that can kind of skew things a little bit, Trevor. But when you look at Navy, they actually, I thought, did a pretty good job against the Air Force rush game. They held Air Force to 158 yards rushing. They held Temple to 35, 131 by Bucknell. Last 4 games, they gave up 274 to Memphis, 192 to UAB, 158 to Air Force, and last week Charlotte had 187 rushing yards, Trevor. This is a team that has been getting gashed in the 3 games after the Navy game. UAB rushed for 75, 61, and 101 yards. And, you look at what Charlotte's done running the football. They ran for 311 against East Carolina, 187 against Navy. They went for 67 against Rice, 137 against Indiana, 13 against Gardner-Webb, 49 against North Carolina, 131 against Georgia Tech. So they have not been – this has been a concern, a problem area for Navy, and it's the strength of Notre Dame. So we're going to talk about some good-on-good matchups. This ain't one of them, and it puts a lot of importance on this part of the game for Notre Dame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Navy has had issues on defense with teams who can consistently move the line of scrimmage. That's one of the biggest issues that they've faced in the run game. And Notre Dame is kind of starting to come into their own with being able to do that. You see that in reflections against, a Stanford defense who held teams like Clemson to season lows at that point when they were playing each other in rushing yards, right? So Georgia Tech was a stout rushing defense, and Notre Dame was able to run the ball quite effectively. 168 against Georgia Tech, 229 against Stanford. So now it's almost like I don't want to call it a breath of fresh air because this is still a Navy defense that you do have to take seriously and execute and do the things that you have to. But Notre Dame was able to run the ball relatively well against teams who were better than Navy at stopping the run. So it's going to be something that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the week and something I'm going to be keeping an eye out on Saturday because Notre Dame has to get back to some of their identity of they are a run-first team, and their most explosive skilled room right now is the running backs, right? So I say that as lightly as I can, but it's the most explosive guys you have on the team right now, proven over and over again, is 4, 24, 20 in the limited carries we've seen out of 21.
Right.
I mean, it's just they're loaded in there. So I expect Notre Dame, especially with what the stats say, to get back to that identity.
And Trevor, we talk about Devin Ford, right? And Devin Ford should not, in my opinion, be taking touches away from Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love and Riley Leonard, right? I believe that to be true. But the reality is Devin Ford would play for a lot of the teams that Notre Dame plays this year as either their starter or their number 2 back, right? I mean, that it's not so much that, Devin Ford stinks. It's more so like, okay, when you've got that on your roster, I have a hard time saying, okay, give 22 touches in clutch situations.
Right.
And that just kind of puts into context, like, give us a top 100 recruit coming out of high school. You know what I mean? And sometimes I feel kind of bad saying the things I say, but it's not so much a knock on Devin. He's a great kid, great worker, solid player. It's just I have a hard time saying take the ball out of the hands of those players. And when you look at the success Notre Dame has had, we talked about with Navy. I love context, Trevor. And with Navy, you look at it and say, okay, well, you didn't necessarily do a great job against certain teams. You've allowed kind of one of your several teams' highest outcomes of the season, like rushing performances of the season, have come against Navy. Best performance, second best performance, things along those lines. And then when you look at Notre Dame, it's the opposite story. Notre Dame has the most yards that Texas A&M has allowed all season on the ground, 198. The next highest total they had is 180. Notre Dame is 5.8 yards per carry. The next highest total is 4.7. In the last 5 games, A&M's defense has given up 52, 89, 168, and 125 yards on the ground. They've held opponents to 2.1, 3.9, 3.3, 2.3, and 3.5 yards per carry. Notre Dame went for 5.8 against them. You look at Stanford, for example. The next highest yardage total that anyone has had against Stanford was this past weekend against SMU, who went for 179 yards. That's 50 below Notre Dame. Notre Dame went for 5.9 yards per carry, had 4 touchdowns. The next highest yards per carry average was Clemson at 5, almost a full yard higher than Clemson. And over a full yard, it was 1.2 higher than what SMU had. And their 4 rushing touchdown doubles up when anybody else has had. It's a third of the rushing touchdowns Stanford has allowed this year. And so, I mean, you're talking about 50 yards more than anybody else has done against that defense. And, I keep kind of going down through the list. Notre Dame's 362 yards and 8.2 yards per carry were the highest that Purdue's given up all year. Oregon, the number 1 team in the country, just rushed for 131 yards and 3.7 yards per carry against Oregon. Notre Dame went for 362 and 8.2. The next highest total that Purdue's getting. Yeah, oh, Purdue sucks. Get that. They do. The next highest yards per carry total that anyone has had against Purdue was 6.0. So Notre Dame is over 2 yards per play. Illinois went for 177 and 4.5. Wisconsin rushed for 228, 5.6 yards per carry. Notre Dame went for 362 and 8.2 yards per carry, 6 touchdowns. It's over a quarter of the rushing touchdowns that Purdue has given up all season came at the hands of Notre Dame. And even the Northern Illinois game, Toledo is the first team to go for more yards against Northern Illinois than what Notre Dame did. And Notre Dame only rushed for 123. Toledo went for 133. They went for 3.6 yards per carry. That is still the second highest total against Purdue against Northern Illinois this year. Notre Dame's 4.4 is the most Northern Illinois has allowed all year. Still, not good performance by Notre Dame, but the point is it's still better than anybody else has done against Northern Illinois. And you go down this line, Trevor, and it's kind of the same story week after week. Georgia Tech, it was the second most yards they've allowed all year. The only team that had more was Marion Hampton, North Carolina. They also, it's third highest yards per attempt. Most rushing touchdowns. They've only given up 4 rushing touchdowns all season in the 7 previous games. Notre Dame went for 3. So when you're talking about, I just went through the entire schedule, and the only team where Notre Dame didn't have a significantly better performance against that team than everybody else on their schedule is the Louisville game. Louisville did a much better job of keeping Notre Dame in check than anybody else did. That's the only one. So you look at it and say, it's not just that they're putting up yards against really good, the context of how are they performing relative to how everybody else does in that area speaks volumes about how good this rushing team has been for Notre Dame this season.
You said at the start of the show, too, that there would be some stats where you'd be kind of surprised when you hear it, because you think of Notre Dame as a rush-first team, and I'm not saying every single output every Saturday has to be what they did against Purdue, right? That's just an unrealistic standard for a team that's not a traditional triple option team, right? But that was honestly one of them for me. Is I knew that Notre Dame was still effective on the ground. Their offense the last couple of weeks has been trending to be a little bit more balanced, but within that, they're still able to maintain what their identity is in becoming a rush-first football team. So I think that's interesting. I appreciate the context there, because, one, that makes me feel a heck of a lot better for what the outcome is going to be on the ground against Navy on Saturday. And 2, it just puts to light how much success Notre Dame is having on the ground against teams whose first priority on defense, not just with Notre Dame, but with every opponent that they face, is stopping the run. So that's the offense kind of getting an identity of, we know what you're good at and we know what your intent is. We're just going to do our thing anyways, and we're going to do it better than any team that you've played.
When Notre Dame has been good, it's because they like, my big beef with the Louisville game was there was no creativity, there was no adjustments, there was nothing unique that you did differently. And they struggled. Every other game, they've done a pretty good job of that. They ran some really unique counter stuff against Purdue that we hadn't seen and had a lot of success with it. Northern Illinois, it was just kind of counter and inside zone, and it wasn't effective. Next week against Purdue, you come out, you do some different stuff with your counter game. It works really effectively. Your inside zone ends up being very good. You talk about some of the different wrinkles. We talked about the pin and pull stuff that they did against Stanford. They ran that again against this past weekend against Georgia Tech. Jadarian Price rips off, I think, a 23-yard gain off of that. They were also doing an inside zone, what I call inside zone load, which is basically getting the way that Georgia Tech plays downhill run. It's going to be tough getting to their backside inside linebacker. So Notre Dame essentially either used a tight end or a second running back to basically just load on that guy, lead block essentially. I don't call it lead, because lead, when I say lead, that's more of a play side lead. This was more of a backside lead where they're running inside zone right. He's taking that inside back or backside. I'll have a breakdown of that tonight on the message board. But there were different wrinkles to it that say, okay, this allowed you to find some success running the football against Georgia Tech. And again, they had an 18-yard touchdown run called back off a hold that to me did not impact the play at all. And so you look at it and say they find a way, say, look, this is who we are. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to find ways to be good at it. And that's going to have to continue against Navy. There's no question about it. So, Trevor, obviously that's an advantage, a matchup that on paper is an advantage Notre Dame. And here's one of these ones where you look at Navy and you're like, they rank 82nd in the country in passing yards allowed per game. They rank 71st in the country in yards per attempt. They rank 106th in the country in yards allowed per completion. And they are the 43rd pass defense in the country in efficiency. And they rank 76 with most gains of 30 yards or more allowed. And they have the on-paper advantage over Notre Dame. I mean, that's like when you're just talking statistically, this is going to be it, right? It's like, okay, yeah, Notre Dame's going to find ways to run the football. Navy is going to do everything in their power to stop Notre Dame from running the football. Can the Notre Dame pass offense finally step up and really have some success? That's going to just kind of be the big question every week, Trevor, until they do it. Yeah, they had a really nice performance against Stanford, and they came out against Georgia Tech. Did some nice things in the quick game, good scheme, quarterback doing a good job. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing that's going to like, wow, boy, got to really worry about that Notre Dame team now that they threw for 209 yards against Georgia Tech, right? This is going to be the matchup. They're not very good defending the pass, and Notre Dame's not very good at throwing it. Which one of these maybe changes a little bit on Saturday?
I agree. It's the $1 million question of at what point is it going to turn on? I mean, after the Louisville game, you and I talked about a lot of this next 3-game stretch. We're going to learn a lot about this football team and kind of like what their identity was going to be to end the season. Right. And now here we are against Navy. And there's a lot of parallels between Navy's defense and some other defenses Notre Dame has faced over this last 3-game stretch. Stanford was a little bit better at stopping the run. They didn't have the best pass defense. Same thing could be said with Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech allowed a lot of big chunk plays in the pass game, but they were known for stopping the run. And I look at this and it's somewhat of the same. There's some individual statistics where Navy's a little better, right? But again, it is the last game in this 3-game stretch for me from an evaluation standpoint where maybe Notre Dame is just going to be maybe a 220, 230 passing yard team per game. Not saying that
I'm
is
good with that actually at this point in time.
I am too.
If they average 230 yards the rest of the year, I'm like, man, they're going to kill everybody they play. They're going to win every game in a blowout.
Sure.
I mean, it just seems like so many yards now, which is insane to say that, but it just seems like, wow, that'd be a huge performance if they could throw for 230 yards. It just makes me
sad.
It makes me really sad.
Well, and it's so tough because to your point, Brian, like nobody's going to look at. I mean, they diced up Stanford for 200 and some odd passing yards, and they went for 209 against Georgia Tech. Like it's in the spirit of becoming more of a balanced offense, and that's what I want to see. For me, the way that I evaluate it, as long as Notre Dame starts playing a little bit above their yards per game average. Right, yeah. Because 230, like they're not far off from 230. Riley Leonard was either close to it or at it in the Stanford game, and about 21 yards away from it in the Georgia.
Yeah, the team was over because Riley came out in the end of the third quarter. Yeah, and he was on pace for I think it was like 305.
Yeah,
I think is what he was on pace for that game. Actually, let me go. I think it was like 220 something is where he was at. He was at 229.
Yeah.
Here's the thing for me, Trevor. It's not so much the yards. The yards are nice. It's the yards per attempt and yards per completion got to get better. I don't care if Notre Dame only throws 13 passes in this game. I really don't. I mean, I'm at the point now where it's like, yeah, it'd be nice if they could come out, but if they can run the football and have some success, running the football, and Riley Leonard goes, let's just say like 10 of 15 for 230 yards. All right. Okay. You know what I mean? Like it's not the yards will take care of itself if the other statistics get better. If the yards per attempt go up, if the yards per completion go up, that is where you start having more success from a yardage standpoint. And so like, yes, I agree with everything you're saying. Efficiency in the throwing game has got to be better, is got to be better, and they've got to be more explosive. And I understand why they're this way, and I don't know that it's going to change against Navy because of that bottom number, because Navy actually is pretty good. They bring a lot of different pressures, and they can get after the quarterback. And I don't know that there's a lot of faith that this offensive line can protect the quarterback, but it's kind of like you got to give them a shot early to see if they've improved, because you've got to be able to find ways to get the ball down the field. there was a conversation on the message board about this today, Trevor, and I still don't understand why Notre Dame recruited Chris Mitchell. And what I mean by that is not that Chris Mitchell's not a good player. If you're going to use him the way you're using him, I don't understand why you recruited him to do that, is my point. Like, I would love to see them use Chris Mitchell the way that Chris Mitchell was used at Florida International. I mean, he averaged over 17 yards a catch, I think, his last 3 years. Like, that's more of my concern. It's like, why aren't you doing more to take advantage of the skills that you do have? You've got a burner in KK Smith. Use him. When he's been in there, he runs by people. You know, I mean, do things to get Jordan Faison the ball in space. Why aren't you doing that? And so I get that you're leaning into we're a running team. Okay, that's fine. But that doesn't mean you have to lack creativity in the pass game. And showing wrinkles each week, which they did last week against Georgia Tech, they showed some wrinkles. We hadn't seen them. I'm happy with that. They had this little go option swing concept to the right with a backside slant. Essentially, you'd kind of get that burst motion, and if they run with it, or if they're cheating to the three receiver side or the field side, then you just come back and bang the backside slant. They did that, I think, 5 times in the game. All right, great. Worked great. That's one step of it. There also needs to be an element of, okay, we're going to try to get the ball down the field in different ways, not just on post routes, but also on some things where you're trying to do some clear stuff. It's just that's the thing, is like that lack of creativity in the pass game has probably been the most disappointing thing for me this season. There's a lot of things on offense that have been a little disappointing this season. That is probably the one that just how they've used this receiving core has just been puzzling, very puzzling for me. And the receiving core hasn't played well either. I mean, let's be honest, they haven't played great either. But you've got to put them in more positions to be effective, in my opinion. And that if they can do that, then I think they should have success. Because, like, Trevor, here's the thing about Navy: the offense is new, basically. I mean, they've been evolving it since last year, but it's really kind of taken off this year. The defense is the same defense. Their head coach was their defensive coordinator in 2022, and PJ Volker's been there, I think, for 5 or 6 years, the defensive coordinator. And last year, Notre Dame went 20 of 25 for 253 yards and 4 touchdowns, 10.1 yards per attempt. And in 2022, Drew Pine went 17 of 21 for 269 yards and 4 touchdowns. I'm sorry. If Drew Pine can throw for 260 yards, and this is not a shot at Drew Pine, but if he can do that with some of the same guys that you have in this game, right? I mean, Jaden Thomas went off against Navy 2 years ago. Do you remember that? Like, Jaden Thomas, I think, almost had 100 yards in the first half by himself. Is he a worse player now than he was then? You had 35 points on this defense at halftime 2 years ago. You know, Braden Lindsey had a 38-yard touchdown pass. Jaden Thomas had a 37-yard touchdown pass. Like, you were ripping him up throwing the football. And you know, Jaden Thomas, 3 catches for 80 yards. Deion Colsey, 2 catches for 50 yards. Well, he can't even get on the field for you now. You know, so, like, you get what I'm saying? So, like, this has to change. If you can't, we've said it before against Stanford, if you can't throw the ball on Stanford, then you're just not a very good throwing team. And they did throw it on Stanford. I need to see him do it again this week and be more balanced. And hopefully, finally, going into the bye week, it can be a thing that allows you to, you know, say, hey, let's build on this. Because, again, Trevor, we'll go back to the last thing. If the Notre Dame pass offense just becomes efficient with the potential for some level of explosiveness, they don't have to be an explosive. It's just they're not going to be an explosive pass game. But, hey, if you don't respect it, we can hurt you. Just give me that. This offense is going to be really, really scary. I'm at the point now where, like, I got to see it to believe it, but I can't stop talking about it because it's still needed if this team is going to achieve its full potential on offense.
I think you said something really key as well is use your personnel groupings the way that they were intended to. I don't think that you brought Chris Mitchell to South Bend to have him run hitches. I don't think that you brought Bo Collins to South Bend to hit him on now screens. I just don't, right? So, you know, for a lot of people, I'm one of those guys. I'm in the audience of people, where's KK Smith? Well, I mean, if they're not going to use Chris Mitchell the way that he was intended, why would they bring in basically a younger version of Chris Mitchell to come in and do the same thing? So I'm sure there's a lot of different reasons for what it is. One reason why I do have a little bit of hope is because last game you started to see Notre Dame with more of an emphasis of getting their playmakers into space. And that's why Riley Leonard had helped him going 12 for 12 for 187 yards. It wasn't 187 yards of like balls in the air, right? I mean, They did a really good job of getting their playmakers in space and letting them work after the catch. But the frustrating thing for me is Chris Mitchell had one catch, I believe, on one target and went for 14 yards. And I think it was a hitch or a comeback where he broke free a little bit, picked up a first down, and then he just wasn't targeted again. It's those are now the inconsistencies in the pass game that are interesting.
Although there was a play where Riley was getting ready to look at him and he would have been wide open for a touchdown and the pressure got in his face immediately, right? And that's part of the problem too.
Sure.
Is that right there. And somebody in the chat, facilitated and forum, said every game the passing game is taking more steps though. And I agree with that sentiment.
Yeah.
The pass game's getting better, but the thing is they're getting better at basically doing what they've been doing. Mm-hmm. They're completing at a higher level. They're getting open a little bit more. Riley's making better decisions. It's not so much that they've evolved the pass game per se. There's in-game wrinkles that they're doing, but that's always been true. They're just getting better at what they're doing. They're not actually adapting what they're doing necessarily to the personnel, and that's hopefully the next step. But maybe this is the evolution. Like, look, let's get them good at the basic stuff first, and once we feel like we can protect the quarterback a little bit, once we feel like, looking at it from the coach's standpoint, once we feel like, hey, Riley's reading it well, he's getting it out there well, the receivers are figuring things out, then we can maybe take that next step. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's it, Trevor, because this is going to be crazy for you. Like, when I say this, you're going to be like, you're going to know that it's true, but it's still going to kind of smack you in the face a little bit. The last two games are the first time all year that Notre Dame has gone over 200 passing yards in the back-to-back games all season.
Yeah.
You want to hear something even crazier?
Yeah.
Navy did it before Notre Dame did.
Fantastic.
Navy went back-to-back against Memphis and UAB. Ooh. So, that's going to be an interesting aspect of this matchup. And then just wrapping things up, Trev, when you look at just the overall Notre Dame has an advantage, but it's not a huge advantage over Navy overall statistically. Notre Dame's at 34.6 points per game, which ranks 26th. Navy's giving up 19.7, which ranks 30th. Notre Dame ranks 63rd in yards per game at 398.6, but they are 43rd in yards per play. Notre Dame has the number 6 red zone offense in the country, touchdown offense in the country. Navy has the 9th red zone defense. Notre Dame is 18 of 22 scoring touchdowns in the red zone. Navy's only allowed 8 touchdowns on 19 red zone opportunities, so that's going to be a really good matchup. Navy's third down defense is kind of average. Notre Dame's third down offense is below average. Notre Dame ranks 61st in 30 yards plays of 30 yards or more. Navy ranks 58th. And then Notre Dame ranks 51st in turnovers lost. Navy ranks 14th in turnovers gained, which could be a big part of this game. That right there, Trevor. So overall, I'd say Notre Dame has a slight advantage here, but it's not much of one. When you're just looking at the numbers. However, when you look at it from a little bit of context, you understand that this is where the Navy schedule really kind of shows itself. We talked about this yesterday. Temple ranks 119th in scoring offense this season. So they're not a very good. They're actually, that's just being nice. They're really bad on offense. Memphis, UAB this year ranks 113th in scoring offense. Air Force ranks 131st in scoring offense. Charlotte this season ranks 100th in scoring offense. And the only team that they've played that ranks in the top 75 in scoring is Memphis at 29. And Memphis went for 44 points against them and had over 600 yards of offense, or at least over 500 yards of offense. Hold on a second. Let me look at that real quick. They had 659. Yeah, 6.9 yards per play. So they've played one offense that's not a top 100 offense, and they've kind of dominated. I'm actually going to go look up and see what Bucknell is. I actually coached against Bucknell back in the day, by the way. They beat us in the last second. I'm still pissed about that. My receivers went off, but we should have won that game. It was when I was at Duquesne, first game of the year. All right, so let's see where Bucknell ranks in scoring offense in the FCS level. So Bucknell, the first team opponent, they rank 41st in scoring at the FCS level. They're averaging 27 points per game. And they scored 21 against Navy. So that's a big difference when you look at this matchup. Is Notre Dame has certainly played a much tougher brand of football. I mean, Texas A&M ranks 19th in the country in scoring defense. Northern Illinois ranks 13th in the country in scoring defense. So yeah, Notre Dame's played some teams that aren't good. Purdue ranks 130th. Stanford ranks 114th. They scored over 100 points in those two games. You know what I mean? Like, so with Georgia Tech ranks 56, partly because Notre Dame just scored 31 on them with the help of the defense. You know what I mean? So when you look at it, it's Louisville ranks 70th. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they just gave up 50 to Miami this weekend. They were much better than that coming into the game. So even Miami of Ohio ranks 47th. That's higher than anyone that offensive ranking is higher than anyone on defense or on offense for like that defensive ranking is higher than anything Navy's defense has faced on offense outside of Memphis, who ripped them up. You know what I mean? So you're talking about Notre Dame playing 4 top 50 scoring defenses and Navy playing 1 top 50 scoring offense. So the context, when you put it in there, Notre Dame has been better this season on offense than Navy has been on defense. But will that continue? But here's the thing, that Navy offense is so good that you have to be great on offense to have a shot to beat them. Because Memphis had 659 and 7 yards, basically almost 7 yards of play, and scored 44 points and lost by double digits. So, it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. So
I think,
go ahead, Trev.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's interesting about Notre Dame is because obviously there's been a lot of scrutiny from the fan base, from myself, from different media outlets around just like what the team has done this year. But then when you take a step back and when you talk about those stats that you had, that Notre Dame is averaging 34.6 points a game, playing 4 top 40 defenses, and some of them are in there in the top 30 as well. It kind of gets you thinking, like, Notre Dame is kind of done from a wider view, like kind of what's been asked of them. It just hasn't been the way that we perceived it to happen, but I think that's what's so interesting about this football team, and what honestly gives me some headaches about this football team is because they will still go out and do the things that they need to, but not necessarily quite in the way that people had expected it to be. It's weird.
They're playing complementary football.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. That's why they're winning this year. But that's also why they're 6-1 and not 7-0.
Sure.
It's also why they rank 26 in scoring offense, not 15, 10, 6. And that ultimately is going to determine Marcus Freeman's willingness or ability to develop an offense that can somewhat match the defense is going to determine whether or not he's a really good coach, which I think we can all agree he's a pretty good coach. Like, some of the people like, oh, he should be fired. I'm like, that's utter nonsense. He's a really good coach from the standpoint of he's going to have you in the top 15 moving forward. I mean, yeah, that's pretty good. That's not the standard at Notre Dame, though, right? The standard at Notre Dame is, can you build a championship team? That's still the question about Marcus Freeman, is because, and again, I'm going to give him somewhat, I'm not going to give him a pass. I'm going to say that I have a little bit of grace about this season because of the fact that they have had the devastating O-line injuries, and we don't know what they would have done had Charles Jagasol and Billy Schrouth and those guys. You know what I mean? Because, like, they did score 66 points the last game that they had, 2 of those 3 injured starters in the game. You know what I mean? So who knows what they would have done? I mean, who knows what this offense would look like if Craig was still in the lineup and Schrouth was still in the lineup, and let's say it was just Pendleton was struggling, or it was just Knapp that was struggling, or just one other. Then you can say, okay, now maybe you can move Rocco in at left guard and solidify things, or maybe you can move Knapp inside to guard and put somebody else out at tackle, and it's just that one move. But when you're missing 3 starters,
right?
It's not a pass, because I'm not giving any Notre Dame coach a pass. This is your job, right? But it's an asterisk of, you kind of understand it. But at some point in time, he's going to have to say, hey, look, just because we score a bunch on offense doesn't mean we can't have a great defense. It just doesn't. Those things are not exclusive. And until he's, I shouldn't say figures that out, until he's willing to do that or able to do that, whichever one it is, then, and somebody said they had those players, Northern Illinois. You're missing the point. We're talking about the evolution of the offense, right? No one's excusing the performance of their season. The point that I'm making is that they were starting to kind of click in that Purdue game. They looked pretty good. They looked like the team we thought that they should be. And then you had the injuries. We don't know how the offense would have progressed moving forward is the point. That's the point. Mm-hmm. And we don't always have to go back to the Northern Illinois game. That was a terrible game. We all understand that. But it's about what are you going to do coming out of that? And what anyone that's being honest is going to say is we don't know what that Notre Dame team would have looked like today if it wasn't for all the injuries. We don't. We don't know what the offense would look like right now. Ashton Craig and Billy Schrouth are now going into game 8 as starters in this season. We don't. And so I'm willing to at least put an asterisk by it, not give them a pass. But it's about how you finish, Trevor.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the key. And yes, they're starting to show signs of coming on, but eventually it's got to stop being signs and flashes and moments, then it's time to take off. And that's going to be the key. So we'll find out if they can do it or not. So, Trev, that's going to do it for the offensive breakdown. Y'all know what to do before we get to the defense, right? You guys know what to do. Hit that like. Hit the subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Share this podcast. If you're listening via our podcast platform, if it's Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, please give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate that. And, of course, go to boards.irishbreakdown.com. Sign up for the message board, and you can continue all these conversations. You can ask even more questions and all that kind of stuff on that message board of me or Trevor, whoever else, and enjoy the intel that we drop when it's there, the breakdowns that we're going to drop when it's there. And there's a new receiver on the board that I'm trying to get a little bit more confirmation from the kid, but we've heard from talked to Ryan last night about it. He heard it from the school the kid's committed to, and then I've heard it from the Notre Dame side of things that they're looking at another receiver. We'll see if it's able to go. I'm in kind of believe it when I'll see it mode at receiver recruiting. So, yeah, we'll kind of see how that goes. But anyway, you can find that at boards.irishbreakdown.com.